Hello and welcome back to PaleoCast. I'm Liz.
And I'm Dave.
And this is episode 90 on Ichthyornis with Dr. Canfield from the University of Bath.
So, Liz, Ichthyornis, why did you choose this as the subject for this episode?
So, I was in Bath a couple of months ago talking to Dan about general bird paleo things, and he showed me these awesome CT scans from this specimen, and then I later found out that he's got this paper coming out in Nature on the specimen, so I thought it would make a great interview to kind of chat about this new material.
And this paper is only just out yet? So this is hot off the press?
Yeah, this is coinciding with the release of the paper, so this is kind of first news of this awesome new specimen.
And you managed to keep it under wraps until then? Did you want to tell everyone if you knew what was going to be in that paper?
I actually didn't know that it was coming out definitely in Nature until about a week ago. So it kind of went off my radar for a while and then was like, oh, this paper's coming out. Cool, let's do an interview.
And it's pretty useful then with him being like in the adjacent uni to ours, kind of like 20 minutes drive away.
Yeah, it was really handy, except also Dan is very busy, so trying to come up with like a half an hour that I could actually get him to sit down and do an interview was kind of difficult. But no, it is handy being kind of right next door.
So this interview is a pretty in-depth discussion about vertebrate paleontology. And so if you're not overly familiar with the skeletal system, as I wasn't, then it might be pretty difficult. But we do have a lot of useful pictures on our website, and we recommend that you look at these as you listen to the interview, as it really helps you understand what they're talking about.
And as always, please like and share the show on social media. If you're feeling particularly generous, we'd love a donation or even a 5-star review. That would be greatly appreciated.
We hope you enjoy this episode.
So I'm here at the University of Bath talking to Dr. Canfield. Thanks for joining, Dan.
My pleasure. Hi, Liz.
Yeah. Can you kind of start off by telling us about yourself and how you got here to Bath?
Yeah, of course. So I am a vertebrate paleontologist. My title here at University of Bath is Prize Fellow in the Milner Center for Evolution in the Department of Biology and Biochemistry. So the Prize Fellow position is an early career position that the university started a couple of years ago. And the idea is that you're essentially a research fellow. Basically, you don't have lecturing duties for 2 years to sort of get your research program established, begin applying for grants, accept some PhD students, and then after 2 years, the fellowship is designed to turn into a sort of a normal UK style lectureship, or basically equivalent to an assistant professorship.
Handy. And you are a fellow Albertan, correct?
Yes, although I'm a Calgary Flames fan, not an Oilers fan. But
you're the enemy Albertan.
yeah, I don't know. We get along pretty well despite that.
So you did your PhD not in Canada, though, right?
No, I did my undergrad in Vancouver at UBC, and then I went over to Yale University for my PhD.
You, like, double enemy. Then you went to the US as well, so...
Right, yeah, well, yeah. American politics were different at the time.
So I guess a lot of the work you do is on kind of ornithology and generally kind of paleoornithology. Would you consider yourself more of an ornithologist or a paleontologist?
I would consider myself more of a vertebrate paleontologist, but I guess not by much. I'm interested primarily from a research perspective in trying to understand the extent to which the fossil record can help us understand how, when, and why modern biodiversity, especially the biodiversity of birds, has come to be, as well as how those specialized features of birds like feathers and flight and a toothless beak, those sorts of biological attributes have arisen. And those are questions that the fossil record has unique potential to shed direct light on.
So I guess mainly what we want to talk about today is this new paper that you have coming out all about Ichthyornis. So can you tell me a little bit about Ichthyornis and sort of why Ichthyornis is interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess for anybody interested in bird macroevolution, Ichthyornis is a really critical fossil taxon. It's one of the closest known fossil relatives of the living bird radiation that is nonetheless outside of modern bird biodiversity. So this is one of the closest known relatives of modern birds from the Mesozoic. And for all intents and purposes, much of its skeleton is, I mean, very difficult to distinguish from modern bird skeletal morphology. And Ichthyornis is particularly interesting because it's one of the earliest it's one of the fossil avialans from the Mesozoic that's been known the longest. The first specimens were discovered in the early 1870s by a field crew in Kansas, and they were initially described by O.C. Marsh, the first professor of paleontology in North America, also at Yale University. So a lot of that really important early fossil material is at Yale, where I did my PhD. And I mean, it's been studied extensively since then. But the majority of the really important Ichthyornis material that was initially described by Marsh and then restudied is that same material that was collected in the 1870s. And even though a lot of that material is quite extraordinary, there are gaps in terms of the skeletal elements that are preserved as well as the skeletal elements that are preserved well. Unfortunately, since that time, despite a handful of postcranial discoveries, very little new material from the skull of Ichthyornis has turned up. And that's a shame because there's a lot of skull anatomy from Ichthyornis that we really don't know much about based on those early 1870s specimens.
You said that it's Mesozoic. Where in the Mesozoic is Ichthyornis?
So the majority of Ichthyornis specimens that have been collected so far have been recovered from the Niobrara Formation, which on average is roughly 86 million years old. So we're firmly in the late Cretaceous. We're about 20 million years prior to the KPG mass extinction. And interestingly, that particular age estimate is right around what I would consider to be some of the most credible molecular divergence time estimates for the age of the most recent common ancestor of crown birds. So there were very interesting things going on in bird macroevolution around that time, and coexisting with in all likelihood, the earliest ancestors of crown group birds. We had Ichthyornis, which, as I mentioned, is one of the closest known stem group relatives of crown birds yet described.
And all of the specimens come from Kansas, or are they kind of
no, the majority of known specimens come from Kansas, but roughly contemporaneous Ichthyornis specimens come from the chalks of Alabama. There are even Ichthyornis remains that have been described from Alberta. There's material that has been described from Mexico and attributed to Ichthyornis-like animals, and there are fossils in need of further study from the Old World as well, from late in the Cretaceous.
I didn't realize how kind of spread out it was. I always thought of it as just sort of Kansas. And
yeah, well, I mean, like I said, it is a relatively conspicuous component of the Niobrara fauna, and there are dozens and dozens of individual specimens known, but most of those are quite fragmentary and incomplete.
And what is the kind of main draw for this new specimen that you have described in this paper?
Well, I mean, there are a number of remarkable aspects of this particular specimen, but one of them is the fact that it preserves a nearly complete skull that is largely preserved in 3 dimensions.
Wow.
And that's quite extraordinary in the context of Mesozoic avialan evolution, since, I mean, even with the addition of hundreds, if not thousands of extraordinarily well-preserved and very complete Mesozoic avialans from the Cretaceous of China, virtually no Cretaceous avialans exhibit nearly complete three-dimensionally preserved cranial remains.
Yeah. I think, I mean, my familiarity with Neobrara in general is pterosaur, and it's all completely flattened.
It's pretty flat.
I can't imagine there's a lot of 3D material at all from that formation.
Yeah, I mean, so interestingly, a lot of the postcranial material that's already known from Ichthyornis is quite well preserved, oftentimes in 3 dimensions, oftentimes also crushed flat. But I guess more resistant elements of the postcranial skeleton, things like the coracoid, the distal humerus, and even in one instance, a sternum, a partial sternum, are very well preserved in 3 dimensions.
Okay. And what is the advantage of having this 3D material? What can you kind of learn with this skull that you couldn't do before?
I mean, having this new 3-dimensionally preserved cranial remains sheds light not just on the morphology of Ichthyornis, but in the broader context of Avialan evolution, because we don't have any particularly well-preserved Mesozoic Avialan skulls. This new material sheds light on what Cretaceous near-crown cranial morphology, near-crown bird, I should say, cranial morphology looked like more generally. And so it provides us with a real opportunity to try to understand how the skull of modern birds came to be, and to what extent at this relatively late stage of bird evolution, plesiomorphic theropod dinosaur-like features of the skull may have coexisted with what we think of as diagnostic crown group bird morphologies. And so the skull does basically provide us with a very interesting mosaic of I guess what you would consider to be primitive and derived features.
So one of the things that you looked at was specifically beak related. Can you talk a bit about why I can't remember exactly what it was, but why the beak was particularly interesting and what you were not expecting to find when you looked at the beak?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there are lots of interesting aspects of what this particular new material tells us about the feeding apparatus of birds. And I guess one of those has to do with the origin of a crown group bird beak, so a beak homologous with that of crown birds. So across the evolutionary history of dinosaurs and reptiles more generally, acquiring a toothless beak-like structure is not that uncommon. I mean, turtles have basically the equivalent of a beak throughout non-avian dinosaurs. There are many instances of dentition reduction. And then within Avialans themselves, there are numerous independent examples of tooth reduction. For example, Confuciusornis, which is quite stemward relative to something like Ichthyornis, is entirely toothless, and yet crownward taxa, such as Ichthyornis, exhibit very extensive dentition. So that tells us that the toothlessness of Confuciusornis is not actually equivalent, not the homologous condition of toothlessness that we see in crown group birds. So the jaws that we have described from Ichthyornis are fascinating because, as O.C. Marsh noticed in the 1870s, the dentition on the lower jaw of Ichthyornis is very, very extensive. So we've known that for a long time. But the upper jaws have not been formally described or imaged beyond a very tiny fragment of the maxilla that was part of the original Yale Peabody Museum collections. And what we found, to our great surprise, is that the maxillae of Ichthyornis were very robust and very extensive. And that's interesting because in crown group birds, the maxilla is greatly reduced at the expense of an extremely enlarged toothless premaxilla. And what we see in Ichthyornis is a very large rostrocaudally extensive maxilla full of teeth along its entire length, with a very small premaxilla, not bearing any teeth, rostral to the maxilla. So we have a tiny, basically what we interpret as the sort of very primitive beak, characterizing the rostral portion of the upper jaw, combined with a very robust dinosaur-like toothed maxilla posterior to it. And another of the exciting insights that we are now able to make on the basis of this well-preserved three-dimensional material is that medial to the tooth row on the maxillae, we have very extensive pits, basically associated with each maxillary tooth. Medial to each tooth, there's a little hole.
Yeah.
And those holes line up in their number, their position, and their diameter with the dentition from the lower jaw. So if you've ever looked at the palate of something like a sperm whale, we think a similar situation is going on there with each tooth from the dentary probably articulating with these occlusal facets in the palatal shelf of the maxilla.
So there is no sort of contact between, or would there still be contact between like the upper jaw dentition on the upper and lower, or would they be kind of separated?
No, I don't think so. I think they would have been separate.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Another part of what you were able to do was look at the brain of Ichthyornis. So can you talk a bit about what was so interesting about that part?
Yeah, I mean, so we weren't able to look at the brain in all that much detail. Yeah. So the cranial material is well preserved. However, it's still crushed in some ways, and so that kind of precluded us from extracting a beautiful three-dimensional endocast.
Yeah.
But I think the insights that we're able to make on the basis of the endocranial morphology are still important, just because, as I mentioned, three-dimensionally preserved aviolin skulls from the Mesozoic are extremely rare.
Yeah.
And so between Archaeopteryx and crown group birds, there are virtually no complete endocasts that have been characterized, with the exception of one particular very enigmatic putative ornithuromorph called Cerebavis cinematica, which is a very interesting fossil in its own right, but it's not associated with any other skeletal material that would allow us to really figure out what it is.
Yeah.
So we have Archaeopteryx, the endocast of which is very much not crown bird-like in its morphology, and then we have crown birds, and now we have Ichthyornis, and essentially what we're able to piece together, it's not very much, but it seems that the endocranial morphology of Ichthyornis is more crown bird-like than the endocast of Archaeopteryx, which is not all that surprising, and I think it'll be very interesting to find out on the basis of new material or further study of this material exactly how crown bird-like the endocast of Ichthyornis was.
Is there anything that you can learn from what you have from the endocast about any behavior or anything like that, or is it not quite?
Yeah, I mean, I'd shy away from too much storytelling there. I guess what's interesting is that sort of in the context of the rest of the morphology of the skull of Ichthyornis, the relatively modern endocast becomes somewhat surprising. And this is getting away from the endocast per se and kind of leads to a discussion of another very interesting region of the skull, which is the area of the upper temporal fenestra. So in this new material of Ichthyornis, the three-dimensionality of the bones allow us to see that the upper temporal fenestra of Ichthyornis was really quite large, and in many respects, in terms of its conformation, very similar to that of Deinonychosaurian theropods, animals like Velociraptor and Zanabazar. And so the fact that we have this very extensive, very large and robust upper temporal fenestra in the same skull associated with a relatively modern endocast is interesting, because for a long time, or at least for a few years, the origin of modern avian endocast morphology was hypothesized to be associated with the reduction of the temporal musculature, which is something that was thought to basically have occurred apace evolutionarily, and the new data that we have here on the basis of the cranial material seems to challenge that idea.
So you had mentioned before Mosaic evolution. Can you kind of explain for listeners who might not know exactly what that means, what it is and also how this relates to Ichthyornis and why that part's important.
Yeah, I guess so. Mosaic evolution refers to, within various anatomical regions of particular organisms, the rate of evolutionary change being different. So certain regions of the skull we think evolved at different rates from other regions. And so the fact that within this new skull of Ichthyornis, we see anatomical regions that are essentially indistinguishable from what we see in crown group birds. For example, the cranial kinetic apparatus of Ichthyornis appears to be very similar to what we see in crown group birds. And yet we still see this very primitive maxillary morphology. We still have jaws that are completely full of teeth. We still have this only, I suppose, incipient premaxillary beak. We really have an interesting and enigmatic combination of features in Ichthyornis that we simply haven't seen all in one animal before. And in terms of trying to understand how, those features of the skull that are common to all living birds evolved, clearly numerous regions were already crown bird-like, 86 million years ago when we're talking about, relatively crownward stem group birds. But other regions of the skull were still very much not like crown birds at all. For example, the temporal region. And so clearly a lot of evolutionary change happened along the internode that essentially leads to crown group birds after Ichthyornis had branched off.
That's really interesting. Is there anything... I know that there aren't really other fossils that are sort of the same age and looking at that in terms of birds, but are there any fossils that you might be able to see these kind of features now that you know that Ichthyornis has this mosaic kind of look, even if they're partial and squashed?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it's going to be interesting to look back at the, incredibly diverse, hierarchically internested phylogenetic suite of Mesozoic oviolans from places like China, that's for sure. But there is also Hesperornis, another toothed ornithurine bird from the Niobrara Formation and elsewhere. And actually, our phylogenetic reconstructions in this paper generally support the hypothesis that Hesperornis is actually crownward of Ichthyornis, which agrees with some other recent work by researchers like Alyssa Bell. And so it may be that in terms of trying to understand the modernization of the avian skull, examining differences between Ichthyornis and Hesperornis may be a very fruitful thing to do. And that's exactly what one of the co-authors on this study, Michael Hansen, is focusing on for his PhD dissertation with very interesting results so far.
Cool. So we'll look forward to hearing more, I guess, about that edge of it later on.
Exactly. Yeah, he's going to have a lot to say.
Cool. Because obviously I work a lot on postcranial stuff. Is there anything that you're able to learn differently about the postcranial skeleton or any sort of mosaic things with?
Yeah, I mean, so the postcranial skeleton of Ichthyornis is really fascinating, and we're hard at work characterizing its morphology. So I've got 2 PhD students in my little incipient lab here at Bath right now, and one of them is focused on studying. There's Juan Benito Moreno. Give him a shout out on PaleoCast.
I'm sure he'll enjoy that.
I'm sure. He is very much interested in examining the 3-dimensional skeletal morphology of the postcranium of Ichthyornis, and yeah, I mean, he's working hard at that, and again, I'm sure he's going to have a lot to say in the coming years.
Cool. Are these studies all done with like CT scans or just morphology?
That's something we've been relying on quite a lot, and in fact, a lot of the insights that we focused on in terms of characterizing the cranial morphology of Ichthyornis were only possible because we, subjected these new fossils to high-resolution micro CT scanning and reconstructed these disarticulated cranial remains in 3 dimensions. So it has been a very useful technique, and it's essentially what we're going to pursue with the postcranium as well.
I mean, I'm always a fan of CT scanning, so I say that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. Well, I think unless there's anything else that you have to say about the paper, anything we didn't talk about
well, I
that you think
mean,
is particularly interesting?
I guess the one thing that I would really like to mention, just because it didn't come up, is the fact that this was a large collaborative effort among many people from many different institutions over many years. And so I did a lot of this work initially in collaboration with Unjin Buller, who's assistant professor of vertebrate paleontology at Yale University. And so Unjin was a member of my PhD committee, and so we started working on Ichthyornis many years ago now. Michael Hansen, whom I mentioned, is co-first author on this paper. He is extremely knowledgeable when it comes to bird craniofacial evolution. He's also got incredible artistic chops. So he was the person who actually put together the three-dimensional model of the Ichthyornis skull that we present in the paper, and he is doing really fantastic work with other ornithurians like Hesperornis as well. And this work also especially drew on contributions from paleontologists in Kansas and Alabama that discovered some of the new material, provided access to it, and prepared the material, and were generally just great collaborators from start to finish. So those are David Burnham from University of Kansas, Dana Arrett and June Ebersol from Alabama. Dana's recently moved to the I believe it's the New Jersey Natural History Museum. Chris Super is a young paleontologist now at the University of Kansas who actually discovered this new specimen right around the time that he was beginning his undergraduate degree at Fort Hays State University. And so, I mean, he's got a great name and he's a great fossil hunter. And so we've been calling this the Super Ichthyornis basically all the way through. And Laura Wilson, also from Fort Hays State University, was a major contributor to this paper. And so, I think we all are happy to take ownership of this work, and hopefully these specimens will lead to exciting new insights in the future as well.
Great. Well, thanks for chatting with me, Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming down to Bath. It's good to chat.
Yeah.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall, with Joe Keating, Laura Soul, Liz Martin-Silverstone and Caitlin Colery. It was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on contributions from you, the listeners. If you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. We'd also like to thank the Ocean Collective for use of their music. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programmes. Subscribe to our Twitter feed @Paleocast and like us at facebook.com/Paleocast to get all the latest news.